he got on Truth Social and kind of ripped into Jimmy Kimmel and his return and was saying that, he would consider legal action. So Trump isn't letting this one go. Brendan Carr really sees himself as someone who's here to enforce Trump's agenda, right? He works for the president.
Maggie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Can you share a bit more about FCC Chair Brendan Carr? You've written about him plenty. I'd love to know more about his background. I know that he worked as a private lawyer before joining the FCC, where he rose to become general counsel before becoming chair. But tell me a little bit more about him.
Yeah, he's this interesting guy because you just described this total Washington bureaucrat type, which he is. He's someone who has spent, really a career at the FCC. He's a lawyer. He thinks very deeply about legal questions. But in recent years, Brendan Carr, who's now the FCC chairman, to be clear, has gotten very invested in Trump thinking, I would say, kind of the intellectual backbone of the MAGA movement, and in getting to know and spending time with the president himself. So he's also a person who likes to go to Mar-a-Lago and Bedminster. He, at one point earlier this year, kind of trolled people by wearing a little golden pin on his suit that had Trump's face on it, like the profile of Trump's face, and everyone freaked out because traditionally the agency he runs is supposed to be independent from the White House. And we can get into all the reasons that the White House doesn't feel that that's necessary, but Brendan Carr has really embraced this pro-Trump approach.
And when does he begin to get on Trump's radar? I know that he was general counsel during the Trump's first term, but he also wrote the Project 2025 chapter on the FCC. And he was hired.
I was going to say he's been involved in Republican and conservative thinking for a long time. He wrote the Project 2025 chapter on telecommunications, but it was really last year. He was in some ways a person who was well lined up to be the FCC chairman, but our understanding is that he kind of hopped a flight down to Mar-a-Lago and went over to Trump to say hi during a event that had a lot of people at it, and that kind of kicked off Trump's thinking about actually nominating him for the chairmanship, which he did earlier than he did for most of his cabinet.
Right. And so how is he thinking about expanding the FCC's mandate? It seems like he wants to, we've seen a lot of Brendan Carr getting involved in television and trying to regulate news organizations, maybe even a late night TV show, but he's also interested in big tech, right?
Yeah, I think that there's this pattern we've seen. I'm a politics reporter. I cover a lot of things across Washington, and we've seen Republicans across Washington, across the country, really think differently about government policy in the lead up to what became Trump's second term. And what I mean is that, 10 years ago, Brendan Carr was part of a movement that was very hands off. Like the FCC and the government should let the markets and let companies do as much as possible. And, this kind of more libertarian thinking, deregulation thinking was really front and center. And it is like, Brendan Carr is still doing deregulatory actions at the FCC, but he's also much more willing to take a hands-on approach, right? Markets didn't, I think, especially in kind of 2020 to 2024, there was this change of thinking among a lot of people, Carr included. They wouldn't describe it as they changed thinking. They would describe it as the country changed, the markets changed. But I think that he is now much more willing to be hands-on. He's much more willing, especially, last week we saw with broadcast news, to be someone who tweets his thoughts to kind of try and push a company in one direction or another. But also when you look at the actual motions and movements at the FCC, he's willing to have the SEC play a kind of more active role in areas that a lot of people wouldn't have expected. So, for instance, looking at companies, launching investigations into companies' DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. That's something that the FCC has done under Carr that I think a lot of people wouldn't have kind of expected or known that the FCC was doing if it hadn't come into the spotlight with this whole Jimmy Kimmel news last week.
And so that's a great transition into my next question, which is I'd love to talk more about this public interest standard. Beyond just interpreting it the way that the FCC chair wants to interpret it, how does one prove that a network is violating the public interest?
Yeah, so the public interest standard is this idea that Brendan Carr is kind of revived from the law. So we talked about how he's a lawyer. He's someone who is, steeped in the law and has a legal basis for things he does. And there's this idea that, well, this part isn't an idea. It's a fact that, broadcasters get to use airwaves that are out there, right? And the FCC licenses airwaves to broadcasters. And because of that, broadcasters have certain expectations that you wouldn't have if you were just to hop on Twitter, X, hop on a social media platform and fire off a tweet because they're actually using these public airwaves. And there's long been this requirement that they serve the public interest. Now, there are a few different parts of serving the public interest. Brendan Carr has really zeroed in several times on news distortion. So, like I said, there's this idea that you're kind of serving the public if you're a broadcaster. He's leaned on that when he says, broadcasters should act a certain way. And then also he's leaned on this idea of distortion. If you're really distorting what the news is, then that's not in the public interest. And maybe you should have your license revoked as a broadcaster. And that's a huge deal for anyone who broadcasts television, right? You need the airwaves in order to serve people. And so this threat from the FCC that maybe they would go after someone's broadcast license is really significant and is something that Brendan Carr has brought up over and over and over again. Has he actually revoked any broadcast licenses yet? No. So far, kind of the threat, it seems like, has often been enough, but he's said repeatedly and said in an interview recently that these licenses should not be sacred cows. The FCC has, I think, we found one instance where they've actually used what's that public interest standard to revoke a broadcast license. And that was in the 1970s in the South when there was a station airing pro segregation content. And not really since then. So he's, reviving this legal concept that's existed for a long time, but saying, hey, we should really be using this.
And how would that be enacted? Would it be a vote amongst the FCC officers and they would vote and the majority would
There's a
decide?
process. There's a process for it, and the company can bring evidence that they weren't distorting news, that they were acting in the public interest. But Carr, as the chairman of the FCC, could initiate these actions, so he does have power here.
So how did he help suspend Kimmel without taking official action against Disney?
Yeah, it's the old bully pulpit, right? Which I think that there were so many people last week who got their first kind of glimpse into Brendan Carr because this was such big news. As Jimmy Kimmel got on late night and he started talking about Charlie Kirk, and suggested at one point that Charlie Kirk was kind of one of their own, referring to MAGA folks, Republican folks. And Brendan Carr went on a conservative talk show, Benny Johnson's show, and he said that uh, basically that was offensive. I'm trying to find the actual quote from him.
He said we can do this the easy way or the hard way, right?
The easy way or the hard way. Yeah, there was something before then that we can pull up later. But yeah, he said to Benny Johnson, "There's an easy way and a hard way to do this," which is more or less a threat, right? There's no other way to kind of think of that claim from a regulator. And he said it again on Truth Social or on X. So this all sent a pretty clear message, I think. And very soon after, we saw a couple broadcast companies, Nexstar and Sinclair, who both they own these local stations that carry ABC, right? Say we're not going to air Jimmy Kimmel, and that really, I think, shot up the ranks, is my understanding, over at Disney, the ABC's parent company, where they decided to pretty quickly. This is over the matter of I think 48 hours, suspend Kimmel's show.
And Nexstar has a deal in front of the FCC, right? They'll have to change some of their rules around local
Yeah.
ownership.
Yeah, and that's Carr has said for a while and that he wants to change rules around local ownership of broadcast to allow someone like Nexstar to own more local broadcast stations. And last week was really an illustration of why that could matter. So Brendan Carr believes that if local stations had more power, they could exercise that power to kind of um, there would be a different balance of power between the local stations and these big companies like ABC, CBS that have been repeat targets for Trump. So you want to allow the local stations to grow larger so that they can kind of, have more muscle. Right now, he would view ABC, NBC, these companies as having much more power than the locals. So getting back to Nexstar, there's a $6 billion acquisition that it wants to do that will require FCC approval in order to do that. And so you really want to please the FCC, right? And we've seen this repeatedly over the course of this year, that I think the way that people view the Trump White House and the executive branch in general is kind of don't piss them off. And in this case, there's something that I don't. In this case, Nexstar has taken these actions and it still has said that it's not going to air Kimmel as it has this big business deal.
Carr recently threw out the first pitch at a Yankees game. He does seem to love the spotlight. We're talking about him on this podcast. He is probably out there more so than any other FCC chair. Does that irk Trump, who loves the spotlight himself, or he's pleased with what Carr is doing and can overlook that?
I can't be inside the president's head today or this week. I think that, speaking generally, it's you know Carr has been a great marketer of himself online, right? And in other times that he's gone to see Trump, or back when Elon was a bigger player, gone to SpaceX launches, like, he is someone who is good at kind of telegraphing himself and saying, "Hey, I get you." As you said, there's always this risk in the Trump world that you fly too close to the sun, right? That you're taking too much attention, that you're too much in the spotlight, which the president does not like. Uh, so that's a fine line that someone like him needs to walk. I think that we've definitely seen efforts from him to be on Trump's radar. And, there have been kind of various accounts this year of Trump hauling Carr over to the White House during a meeting or calling him. So there's definitely some communication. Do I think that, Trump wakes up thinking about Brendan Carr every day? No, there are a million things going on, but they have a good relationship so far, as kind of, reporting and our knowledge goes.
And so Carr claims to be a champion of free speech and the First Amendment, but I'm wondering how he squares that with some of the actions he's taken, especially where he's basically deciding what should be allowed on TV and what shouldn't, even if it's not through official FCC rulings, but putting pressure on companies.
Yeah, and that all goes back to that airwaves piece, right? He would say, if he were here, that because broadcasters are using the airwaves, they have certain responsibilities written into law that we should be enforcing, right? And that it's not unfettered free speech is not exactly how broadcasting works. On the other hand, he has been very bullish when it comes to free speech on social media, for example, letting people post whatever they want. Some of that thinking does line up with what's advantageous for Republicans right now, right? So I think that people like Brendan Carr were particularly angry in 2020, and he's talked about this when, Twitter made an effort to not let tweets about Hunter Biden. There was a New York Post story about Hunter Biden's laptop, and they didn't allow that to fully go viral on the platform. And he would call that, censorship that should never ever happen. On the other hand, when you look at things like what we saw last week with Kimmel, I think there's a real debate to be had, and people have been having it over, is that challenging free speech too, or is that, as he would argue, enforcing federal law?
Some Republicans have spoken out against him, worried that Democrats might take action against Republican viewpoints. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I mean, well, Ted Cruz has been one person. Ted Cruz kind of returned to a more traditional conservative mindset, saying, like, this is not what you want. Other people have said, yeah, would you want a Democratic FCC acting this way? So I think that there is people who have that more old school conservatism bent and really would have approached this, like I was mentioning before, in a more hands-off fashion, have, I think, found this alarming, especially people who are like free speech, people who really, really focus on free speech. When I was reporting on Brendan Carr, we talked to some folks that work for a kind of more libertarian leaning free speech organization who said that this person is a real threat to the First Amendment. So there are those concerns out there on the right and obviously on the left.
Jimmy Kimmel has returned to television, but that doesn't mean that Carr will accept the fact that he's returned. So do you think that Carr will take action against Disney, maybe revoke their local station broadcast licenses?
We'll see. The president said in a True Social last night that there should, basically this isn't over, right? He got on True Social and kind of ripped into Jimmy Kimmel and his return and was saying that, he would consider legal action. So Trump isn't letting this one go. Brendan Carr really sees himself as someone who's here to enforce Trump's agenda, right? He works for the president. And so maybe, we don't know exactly where this train is going now that Kimmel is back on air, or where, we talked about Kimmel, but, Stephen Colbert was canceled earlier this year. That was a big moment for late night. And I think that a lot of these late night hosts are kind of, viewed by Republicans as Hollywood type elites, right? Who are never going to be on their side. So they make a convenient target.
Maggie Severns is a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.